My free history. There's much to say about the Janissaries, but their main purpose always was war, and this is what we're going to talk about in this video. The Janissaries fight. Although Ottoman forces traditionally focused on cavalry, the infantry and therefore the Janissaries were an essential part of the Sultan's military too. Though Turkish tribal cavalry took a leading role in such campaigns, infantry were needed to hold fortified places. The earliest Ottoman campaigns in Thrace, on the European side of the Dardanelles, involved more infantry, and the next phase of expansion, which included the siege of main roads and mountain passes, again required foot soldiers. At first, this task did not fall to the Janissaries like Weinstein tells us. The Janissaries were not at the beginning the most efficient part of the army, nor the true instrument of the Ottoman conquest that they would become later on. Initially, they were mostly imperial bodyguards who aimed to protect the sovereign, very much in the ancient tradition of the slave guards of the Muslim princes. But this would change soon enough, when the Sultan had a cunning plan. The importance of the Janissaries in the military field would increase dramatically in connection with two factors. First, they became a decisive tool in siege warfare thanks to the specific ability to act as a monolithic and compact block in the final assault. The second and probably even more decisive factor was, following the example of the Balkan armies, the progressive adoption of firearms, more precisely the musket, instead of traditional weapons, in particular bows and arrows, starting from the beginning of the 15th century. Now that we have found out about the intentions of deploying the Janissaries in war, let's turn to battles. A good battle starts with good preparation, and that's why we are going to investigate the Ottomans' rituals before battle. In camp, communal worship was held half an hour before sunset, when the order imams recited prayers. Signal cannon were then fired, and the troops would call good fortune and health to the Sultan, commander and officers. Vedettes were posted, these being changed to the sound of signal cries and music. And then the Ottomans would deploy. Bertrand de la Procrea describes the Ottomans assembling for battle. When they are ready and know where the Christians are coming and where they are, they leave quickly in such a manner that 100 armed Christians would make more noise leaving their camp than 10,000 Turks. All they do is beat a large drum. Those who are supposed to leave get in front, and all the rest fall into line without breaking up the order. So, the Janissaries sneaked out of their camp, but still insisted to beat the drum, thereby destroying every opportunity of a surprise attack. Therefore, they had to deploy for conventional battle instead. There was one pivotal element in Ottoman battle tactics. Turkish cavalry tactics centered around the bow. Its greater rate of fire and range allowed the cavalry to stay well out of harm's way while they slowly tired and destroyed the enemy. Let us look at the typical positioning of Ottoman troops to better understand this quote. Konstantin Mihailovich describes the center of the battle deployment. The order of battle in the army of the Sultan is as follows. The courtly cavalry stands at the side of the Sultan. At the front, the Janissaries take their position. Behind them, the camels. The Sultan never moves to another place, but stays with the Janissaries until the battle is over. Although Mihailovich stacks this an earlier source, we can already see the basics of the classic Ottoman formation, which they developed until the 16th century. Just as in every other aspect of the empire, the Sultan was the center of everything. Together with his household troops, he formed the core of the army. The Janissaries stood in front of him, and the household cavalry covered his flanks. Very often the Janissaries dug trenches, planted stakes, or built up other defenses in order to improve their position. Usually artillery was distributed among them. But the army consisted not only of household troops. On the flanks in front of the household cavalry fought the provincial cavalry. In general, the Sipahis from Anatolia held the right flank, while the Sipahis from Rumelia occupied the left flank. This picture gives us the hardcore of the Ottoman army, which would fight and, often enough, win the battle. Nevertheless, the first engagements would be fought by other troops. The vanguard of the army was made up by light cavalry as well as infantry. While the light infantry usually stood in front of the Janissaries and sometimes intermixed with them, the light cavalry patrolled in front of the flanks but also had an advance guard. Their task was to create a situation fitting to the Ottoman dispositions. Now, let's see some action. Although many soldiers might have wished differently, most deployments were followed by battle. We'll find out how the Ottoman hoped to win the slaughter. The opening of the fighting fell to the light troops. Ahead of them all ranged Akinci light cavalry, whose task was to draw an enemy towards the Artsabs. They in turn would absorb this charge, then move aside to allow the artillery and Janissaries to open fire. So the first step in Ottoman tactics was to open battle with skirmishers. The intention was to terrorize the foe till it became unbearable, and thereby lure them into a stupid attack. The light cavalry showered the enemy with arrows and then retreated. They would surrender the field and join the cavalry on the flanks while sustaining pressure on the enemy with arrows. If the enemy fell for this trap, the second task fell to the light infantry, which screened the Janissaries. They would receive the first brunt of the attack and thereby slow down the momentum of the enemy charge. But they would not stand and fight. Just like the light cavalry, the light infantry would fall back and channel the storming enemy directly into the guns of the Janissaries. At this point, the retreating had to end. By fleeing the field, the Akincis drew out the heavy Christian cavalry and while tiring their mounts, also tried to lure them onto the spikes ranged before the Janissaries' redoubts or trenches. But they would also repeatedly swoop down the flanks of the enemy cavalry and inflict damage difficult for the cumbersome knights to turn and meet. The climax always lay with the formidable firepower of the trained Janissaries. The Janissaries started to fire the muskets. With the support of artillery, the task was to halt the enemy. Any defenses built up before the battle would come in handy at this point. If the Janissaries fulfilled their task, they could prohibit defeat. But the task to achieve victory lay with other troops. Although the highly disciplined Janissaries most impressed the Europeans, their importance was far less than that of the Sipahi cavalry, the battle-winning offensive element in the classic Ottoman army. While the Janissaries nailed down the enemy, the light cavalry and infantry, who in the beginning retreated, inflicted losses on the enemy. But then the attack of the cavalry on the flanks followed. If possible, they would surround the foe and thereby achieve a decisive victory. This is why Mihailovich sees it as a grievous mistake to attack the Sultan and his guard directly. He gives accounts of the Battle of Kosovo and Varna, where the cavalry in the front was beaten, but the following assaults on the center failed. In these battles, a special defensive arrangement came into play. The Ottomans first encountered the Wagenburg in the fight against János Hunyadi's troops in 1442. Wagenburg is a German word and in the literal translation means wagon fortress. It consists of carts arranged for defense purposes like those you can see in Wild West movies. It was a mobile, makeshift defense. In order to improve it, the wagons were chained together. The defenses could be strengthened further by putting cannons between or on the wagons. As we have just heard, it was essential for the Janissaries to prepare fortifications. The mobility of the Wagenburg made this task easier. After finding out about this tactical improvement, it did not take the Ottomans long to incorporate it. It is not known when the Ottomans first used the Wagenlager. Whereas at the Second Battle of Kosovo, 1448, it was the type of defensive embankment that had served the Ottomans so well at Varna in 1444. A deep trench and a dirt embankment strengthened with iron stakes and large shields, behind which stood Janissary archers, arquebusiers, cannons and camels, laden with rich baggage. Combined use of artillery, arquebus and tabur is usually cited as a decisive factor in the Ottomans' victory at the Battle of Bashkent in 1473. So in 1473, at latest, was the first successful use of the Wagenburg. Since the Ottomans first learned about the Wagenburg when it was used by an enemy, the question is how to overcome such a bulwark. The Ottomans themselves used a winning strategy at the battles of Varna and Kosovo by not attacking. Instead, they surrounded the enemy position but stayed out of range of the guns on the wagons. This was like a siege on open field. The Wagenburg faced the same problems as every other fortress. Especially from the late 17th century onward, the Wagenburg lost its effectiveness due to advances in field artillery. But what if the enemy broke through the lines of the Janissaries anyway? Well, in the description of the battle deployment I left out an essential part. The Ottomans had another trick up their sleeves. Very close to the Sultan was the imperial treasury, and directly behind him the baggage train, or camels as Konstantin Mihailovich calls it. Every enemy soldier breaking through the Ottoman defenses and ending up in their camp would be overcome by the lust of plunder and immediately try to secure his part of the baggage or even the treasury. This would buy time and maybe even give the forces on the flanks time to win the battle anyway. This is a creative way of thinking if you ask me. What would be a more promising method to overcome the Janissaries' defenses? Konstantin Mihailovich suggests an ingenious plan. There is another fact which shows that it is better not to attack the Janissaries in the front, but instead shoot fire arrows at the camels behind them. The camels, panicking because of the fire, will throw themselves on the army and trample all Janissaries. On the other side, they should be kept under fire with artillery. Mihailovich sees the shattering of the core of the Janissaries as an integral part of his strategy against the Ottomans. If the Janissaries ever get hit on the head and remain dead on the battlefield, the Sultan could not compensate for this loss. All Christian lands under his rule would rise against him and drive him back over the sea if he ever lost his core. So it was essential to keep the cause of the Janissary alive, and the best way to do this was to have a good defense in battle. Not every battle can be won by waiting. The example about the Wagenburg given above proves this. Sometimes even the Janissaries had to attack. We'll find out what this looked like. The main offensive role in Ottoman tactics was still given to cavalry, who attempted to break the enemy line. The Janissaries would then fire their guns and attack in a dense mass with swords and other weapons, usually a single rush in wedge formation. Rushing with swords in hand. That sounds very much like assaulting fortification, and this is the topic we are going to turn to now. Through sieges, the Janissaries first came to prominence. Let's remember Weinstein. The importance of the Janissaries in the military field would increase dramatically in connection with two factors. First, they became a decisive tool in siege warfare thanks to their specific ability to act as a monolithic and compact block in the final assault. Here it is necessary to mention the Head Risker, a volunteer elite assault unit. You can probably guess the mission by the name. Nevertheless, here's Nicole describing an attack out of trenches during the siege of Vienna in 1683. Assaults on the defenses were made by day and night, illuminated by beacons and gunpowder flares, and small head-risker units of 30 and 100 volunteers were sent against limited objectives. These volunteers were usually divided into smaller groups of 5. These bands consisted of a swordsman, a grenadier, an archer, and perhaps 2 musketeers. Murphy discusses the use of muskets in assaults during sieges. According to Silada, in the final phases of battle the handguns, issued as a matter of course to the Janissaries, had a rather restricted application. It seems they were used more to provide safe cover for the troops as they rushed forward from the trenches to scale the walls than as offensive weapons in their own right. A final volley fight in unison was more often than not used merely as the preliminary to a clash of swords, hatchets and halberds, or the launching of spears which typified the fighting in close quarters. After the volley, the muskets became useless. Under conditions of close combat, the resumption, still more the sustaining of musket fire, was too risky, since each halt for the reloading of the weapons placed the advancing soldiers in a fatally vulnerable position. Its supposed status as an outmoded weapon did not alter the fact that, for purposes of the final melee, which inevitably ensued as part of the closing phase of battle, the saber proved a more useful tool of the trade. Murphy sums up the use of the musket as following. Advanced weaponry, whether for use in major conflicts or in the context of small skirmishes, played a mostly non-critical role in determining the outcome of battle. Goodwin's description is very similar. The trenches which the Janissaries dug when besieging a town or fortress might be orderly, but when they stormed a breach there could be no question of it being drill. The charge was confused and impetuous. The unholy shrieks and yells for which they were renowned were common to any man in a moment of danger, but were the more terrifying because the result of trained intent. Even they were surpassed by the demonic howls and roars of the shock troops who went before them, orchestrated by the hysteria of fanaticism. And this probably is a good place to take a look at what we learned today. Although the Ottomans relied heavily on cavalry, they could not just ignore the need for infantry. In the beginning, the Janissaries were imperial bodyguard, but since they were the first modern standing army, the Janissaries showed their value as a monolithic block in final assaults. The Janissaries had a vital task in battle. Light troops tried to lure the enemy towards them. They had to stop the attack at any costs. To achieve this task, they utilized fortifications. From the Hungarians, they learned to use the Wagenburg, just like cowboys. When the Janissaries achieved to nail down the enemy, the cavalry would advance on the flanks, try to surround the enemy and annihilate him. Should this fail, the baggage train as well as the imperial treasury served as diversions to buy time for the soldiers to regroup. On the offensive, the Janissaries followed attacks of the cavalry, fired a single volley and then charged in wedge formation. In sieges, attacks were not much different, although there was a prelude of digging trenches before an attack. The so-called head-risker units were divided into small groups with a mixture of different weapons at its disposal. The assault was usually not very orderly. Instead, the Janissaries rushed forward, screaming their souls out. This was the more terrifying because it was part of the Janissaries' training. We can close this video with a look into the future. Tactics, which should have changed to meet the increased firepower of the Ottomans' enemies, remained the same, as if change were against the nature of the Ottoman soldier. It was not a question of national temperament, but generalship. The basis of the Ottoman attack, and they attacked too often, wasted lives in a wild encircling swoop, with wave falling on wave, as if the undisciplined tribesmen were in command. The best troops were still endowed with a Ghazi spirit, when warfare had become a science. It was fatal. And now it's your turn again. Which place in the battle array would you choose? So long, we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.